Hey, everyone, and welcome back to Above the Tree Line. We are here with Austin Christian Fellowship Senior Pastor, founding and Senior Pastor Will Davis Jr.
Mufasa. Ooh.
We have such a fun topic. And,
this is great.
There's the onus is on you here. You're gonna have to really tackle this one. Okay, so
let's do it.
We are currently in the season of Lent, the Lenten season, and approaching Easter, which really kind of begs the question: if the resurrection didn't happen, all of Christianity is just doesn't matter.
Nice sound effects, by the way. Thank you for that.
Doesn't matter.
It's good.
So we're in a season where we're about to celebrate the resurrection, but a lot of people have no proof that the resurrection actually happened.
They have no proof, or they don't believe there's proof.
Oh, okay. Well, let's start with that. What proof?
I'm already punchy over here.
What proof do we have that the resurrection actually happened?
It is maybe one of the best documented historical facts on the planet. It still requires faith. Okay, nothing of Christianity is ever going to be without faith, including believing in the resurrection. But if you're looking for something that's pretty easy to believe in, this is a good one.
Wait, you say it's one of the most well-documented events in history.
And
but documented by who? But documented by the Bible.
Documented by the Bible, but also by history. So if you just look at the behavior, the very fact that the church exists, okay, argues for something. Like my good friend Lloyd Hampton, Dr. Hampton, who is an atheist, I said, bottom line, sir, what's your belief on Jesus Christ? And he belched. We were having a beer together. He belched and said, I don't know, but something sure as heck, and he said a different word, happened. And that's the truth right there. You don't go from 120 people to 1 billion people.
But what about the other faiths, like Islam?
None of them claim a resurrection.
No.
This was a persecuted group that was in hiding before the claim of the resurrection and came out in unbelievable boldness and were willing to, 40, 50, 60 years later, after the quote-unquote lie of the resurrection, die horribly for that lie. And then they just got with wildfire after that. So that's not the best reason to believe, but the existence of the church and the way it's exploded over history and over that 2,000 years, and it maintains that, and this little detail of a missing body of Jesus. Which, with all the stuff going on, this is not Jimmy Hoffa days. These guys couldn't hide this as well with the scrutiny of Rome and the Jews on them. This is a hard thing to pull off.
So just for context, the bad guys believed that Jesus' followers would come and take his body because they wanted to say, oh, he came back alive. So they have the stone in front of the tomb.
Yeah, and
they
guards.
have soldiers there guarding so that nobody can come and take the body.
Yeah, and so the theory is that somehow the disciples came, either overpowered the guards or bribed them at the risk of their lives, and pulled off this heist of Jesus' body, moved a stone, broke the seal of Rome, all those things, and somehow pulled it off and lived to tell about it, and were so committed to their lie that they became emboldened and preached that lie for the next 60 years, and it's still around today. I remember watching a well-documented atheist recently pushing back on religion, and he said to another friend of his, could 1 billion people be wrong? And I was like, yeah, but that's a little arrogant. I'm like, you're right, because you don't believe. And 1 billion people who have encounters of Christ are wrong. You can go that way, but you might want to be a little more humble about that. Anyway, we have the biblical accounts, 4 different gospel accounts of the resurrection. The Apostle Paul arguing that he himself witnessed Christ after he was resurrected and had an encounter with him. And the documentation of that is pretty significant. You also have these really vivid eyewitness accounts in the Gospels that they do argue over who got to the tomb first. Were the women there first? Which woman was there first? It's like you see a car wreck and one guy says, yeah, I think his blinker was on, and somebody else says, no, his blinker wasn't on. They both agree, though, that the cars hit. No one disagrees on the resurrection. They disagree on if the women got there first or the men got there first. There's eyewitness accounts that don't line up. But they're not confused on if Jesus rose or not. That's pretty much agreed on in scriptures.
In scriptures. But what about if you're not a Christ follower or a Christian and you don't believe that the Bible is a relevant or reliable source to prove the resurrection, what other historical documentation is there outside of the Bible?
Well, there's all kinds of documentation, but it's all based mostly on scripture. There's a couple of historical notes of the rise of Christianity and this belief that that Jesus had risen from the dead, but it's very minor. So clearly, the best documented evidence is not just the New Testament, but 20-something thousand copies of it that we have that just exploded after Jesus' resurrection. To the questioner out there, I'd say, okay, so give me a better theory. And let's do our theories. Okay, so if he didn't rise, and I don't believe he could have risen from the dead, nobody does this, God doesn't do that, this guy was a man. So let's look at the other theories. And they're pretty fanciful. They're pretty funny. And there's less evidence for those theories. One is called the swoon theory, that Jesus fainted on the cross and he didn't die, that when they stuck the sword in his side, the water and blood, which indicated his heart had stopped beating, was misinterpreted, and that he fainted. And in the coolness of the tomb, he came back to life and was able to overcome the beatings of the cat of nine tails, all the blood loss, move the stone away, and convince the guards that he was alive and show himself as the risen Christ who had not been, in fact, crucified at all. That's nuts. They saw him die.
Yeah.
The Romans saw him die. They saw that you don't survive a crucifixion like that. Okay? The other theory is that he simply was stolen. And if that's the case, then all you got to do is present a body. Case closed. And we hadn't had it in 2,000 years. You would think in 2,000 years of archaeology and torture and suffering that somebody's going to go, okay, this is not worth it. Let me tell you where he is. And it's just the opposite. They're emboldened. So I would welcome the skeptics to send us better theories than he actually rose, because that tends to be where the evidence is. If you look at the life change and the documentation and the history of the church, the miracles performed still today in his name. So here's the other thing, Lauren. You and I sit here about the resurrection talking about it. We both talked to him this morning. I hear him all the time. It's hard for me to argue he's not alive when some people even argue that it was a symbolic resurrection. Well, that's not a resurrection.
Yeah.
That he said he resurrected in a spirit. Well, where's his body again? But that's not a resurrection. Death has to be defeated, which means the body has to rise again for death to be defeated. Anyway, you and I both have conversations with him all the time.
Yeah,
I don't
but
think
you
we're crazy.
realize if somebody who's not a Christ follower, that kind of sounds crazy.
You're right, and it's not my lead argument.
Right. Well, how do you know Jesus is alive? Well, I talked to him this morning. Be like, well, then you need to be locked up.
That's fine. Maybe we do.
Maybe we do.
For other reasons. I'm sure there's some truth to that. Give me a better theory.
Okay,
Let's put the onus back on them.
Okay.
And say, okay, you don't think he rose? Let's go. Give me your theories. And they're all kind of goofy.
So it didn't, you can't refute that Jesus existed. Almost like all humans know that Jesus existed.
People do refute that Jesus existed.
Really?
Yes, they do.
But it's so documented
It's taught at the University of Texas that it's quite questionable if Jesus was real. That's wonderful revisionist history. That's not based on any kind of fact.
Right.
And even the scholars who don't believe in Jesus say, okay, it's documented, he was real.
Yeah, and other faiths that don't believe he's the
you
Savior.
have to stick your head in the sand.
Acknowledge.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go with we have proof that Jesus lived.
Okay.
Then when we talk about the resurrection, that's primarily documented in Scripture.
Yes.
So how many eyewitnesses were there after the resurrection, the people that physically saw Jesus alive again?
If you trust the Apostle Paul, up to 500 at one time. So
500 total.
Yeah, no.
Or just one time.
The biggest group at a time was 500. So you've got the disciples, and the morning of, you got the two encounters in the upper room over a week apart, where all the disciples were there, minus Thomas, who was there the second time. You got the crowd on the Mount of Ascension, however big a crowd that was. It was 80 or 90 people. It was the disciples plus whatever group wound up in the upper room. The scriptures said The crowd saw this. Many believed, but some doubted.
Right.
They saw the ascension
Yeah.
and still weren't sure what they had seen. And I think the scriptures are really cool for acknowledging that, and everybody got it. So you've got a few hundred there, maybe 100 tops, and then you add Paul's encounter on the road to Damascus, which was him and a few guys, and you've got this encounter later on where Christ appeared to up to 500 people, according to Paul.
How do we know that Paul's account was like legit though?
You ultimately have to take the integrity of Scripture, and that's an argument people make all the time, is that the Scripture's integrity are questionable there. Mm-hmm. So that's the atheist take, is you can't believe 1 Corinthians 15. And the other chapters teach that. And they're going to say that anyway. You can't believe any of the Scriptures. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to argue Scripture with somebody who doesn't believe the Bible to begin with. I'll give you don't believe, that's fine. If I believe in the validity of Scriptures, then there's no reason to doubt Paul. Mm-hmm. Who did go from being Saul to Paul for some crazy reason.
Right.
So that's there's something there.
I just always wondered, like, especially when you follow kind of like the atheist roundtable discussion we had in Austin many years ago. How can you prove the resurrection not using the Bible as a source?
You can argue very effectively for it. I don't think you can prove any of this. I think that's part of the story. Ultimately, it comes back to faith. But if you just start lining up the cases, I used to debate in high school, and we do flow charts of arguments and see where arguments got dropped off. So it's like comparing a phone. You get these traits, these traits, these traits. So if you line up the arguments for the resurrection, for those that are against the resurrection, and you start looking at the holes, I mean, the best arguments are for the resurrection. And I'm not completely objective on that, but I'm trying to be. And if you look at what the pushback is, it's pretty weak pushback. It's the greatest heist in history, pulled off by an unorganized, uneducated, oppressed few group of men against a Roman powerhouse and a Jewish powerhouse. That's a pretty good heist if they pull that off.
Yeah.
And I don't believe the swing theory, obviously. I think that's nuts. I mean, Jesus was executed, okay?
Yeah.
He died. So then we have this thing of, then somehow they made everybody look the other way and pulled off the greatest heist in history.
Is there any historical documentation outside of the Bible that details the crucifixion of Christ?
Josephus mentions it, I believe. It's scant, but it's there. There are a couple of historians that talked about Christianity, and they had a follower who was crucified under Rome. Okay. And that's all it says.
So why, when Jesus, he fed the 5,000 when he was alive, why would only up to 500 people come to see him after he was resurrected? That's a significantly smaller number than the people that came to see him when he was alive.
Well, that's depending on, he would have appeared to them. He didn't put up a notice and say, I'm going to be at the bar next door at 5 o'clock, come see me. He showed up to a crowd. And so the crowd happened to be 500 people at that point. Everywhere he went post-resurrection was unannounced. So you couldn't say, hey, we're going to see Jesus tonight, come see him. It was like he just happened to show up one time, maybe one of his last appearances, or unless Paul's referencing the Mount of Ascension, which it could be. He said there's a time he showed up to 500 people. That could be the Mount of Ascension, the last appearance. I don't know. But it was just, he didn't tell us he was coming. He just showed up.
Right. Okay, another question. So I have used
you have another question? I'm shocked.
I've used this argument before where I would say that the greatest, for me, the greatest evidence of the resurrection was the people who were so willing to die for what they had seen afterwards, which is what you mentioned earlier. But I did have one person come back and be like, well, what about people in other faiths who are so willing to die for their religions?
And that's and David Koresh was willing to die for his lie up there in Waco.
Yeah.
Deceit can be really powerful. But the bulk, it typically happens when the leaders of those faith movement dies and they're not legitimate, the faith movements tend to go out. What happened to Christianity is stunning, that it went from outlawed to being the official religion of Rome in 300 years. That's intriguing.
Right.
There's something behind that. It still requires faith, and it still could be wrong. But if you look at the evidence of what's happened in history and the encounters people have had with Jesus and the miracles done in his name and the testimony of the documentation of Scripture, which is the best documented. It could be wrong. The Scriptures could be wrong. But it's the best documented ancient work on the planet. Suddenly there's this proliferation of New Testament documents. So we've got to get this out there. That's a pretty well-organized lie. If it's a lie. And I don't think those guys are that sophisticated. They were fishermen. They weren't making this up as they went. They're like, we got to get this word out. And it just exploded. So it implies something happened that shook this planet and is still honestly shaking it today. And again, I don't want you to believe in Christianity for lack of a better argument, but give me a better argument. I'm open. Let's hear your best shot on where is Jesus?
So one of the reasons I love this podcast is because I'm going to give you a compliment.
You get to talk to me for 20 minutes?
Yes. You're a highly intelligent human being. And I know a lot of Christians, a lot of Christ followers that are very intelligent, that do their research. They are very learned. They are very studied. But that's why it drives me nuts sometimes when people say, you got to check your brain at the door to believe this.
It's just
because I'm
opposite.
like, that's just insulting. Like we have done, believe me, I want to be right. I want to follow the right faith, and I have done my research. But then the ultimate takeaway is, oh, well, you don't think for yourself.
That's the wonderful play of the atheists that say, well, you check reason at the door.
Yeah.
And Christians don't think, and they're all wanting to have empirical evidence that God exists, and God doesn't exist in the empirical. If that's all there is, case closed. But the empirical is a reflection of a bigger realm, and you can't test tube and prove God, otherwise he's not really God. He's got to be infinite to be God, and so it's a self-destructive argument. I wrote a book one time out of anger because a girl walked into Bible study and said, I want to know if you really have to check your brains at the door. And I wrote a book called Why Faith Makes Sense. Why it's rational. All faith is reason extended at its highest level. So let's be reasonable. Jesus predicted his resurrection. The Old Testament scriptures predicted the resurrection. Jesus called for it. And then all of a sudden he's not there 3 days later on the exact schedule he said he'd be. Okay, we can't find his body. The church exploded. Does reason imply, even though it goes against the laws of physics, and the laws of all the thermodynamics and the laws that we understand about death and biology, it's not unreasonable if the supernatural exists to think Jesus rose from the dead. That, I think, is logical to at least be open to. But if you don't believe in a supernatural realm and a spiritual realm, you've got no argument.
Yeah. It is interesting because I was even sitting here saying like, okay, put the Bible aside. What other historical documentation is there for this? But I'm like, if you wouldn't say that the Bible is reliable historical documentation, what makes any of the rest of it reliable? It could all be made up if we're going to go the conspiracy theory route.
So it could be made up, but why does the Bible so openly talk about the failures of the disciples and the lack of faith, and Thomas not believing, and Peter's denial, and Judas' betrayal, and David's adultery, and Moses? I mean, if the Bible's written to persuade people how great Christianity is, can we cut out some of these shenanigans that all these guys did?
Jacob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The lies, the deceit, the rape, the incest, the Samson story. I mean, can we cut? I don't really see them saying, hey, let's go ahead and make me, Peter, let's put me in there denying Jesus. We don't need to have that in there. We need to have me cutting off somebody else's head.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, wait, okay, so here's the other thing. You mentioned Isaiah. So, like, it's predicting, this is the Old Testament. The Old Testament, this is a Jewish book that the Jewish people know that predicted, the coming of the Messiah, the death, the resurrection. But somehow, right at the end of the Old Testament, Jesus' own people, the Jewish people, did not adopt the New Testament. The Jewish people, the faith as we know it today, does not believe in the New Testament. And I wonder if that's kind of a knock against Christianity, because it was like, oh, we were all together up until that point, and then Christians went this way.
Well, no. Christianity was birthed in Judaism.
Yeah.
Those 3,000 converts on Pentecost Day were all Jews. And it exploded before it ever got, it was years before it ever got to Gentiles. So Christianity was birthed by a Jew into Judaism.
Yes, but our churches are separate now.
Yeah, Christianity has moved away because they believe the Messiah has indeed come. The problem, if you read John 7, there was a lot of misinformation about Jesus, that some people thought he was from Nazareth, and the Bible had said he would come from Bethlehem. So didn't really have all the facts about Jesus. That's still true today. But they really expected in that culture a political leader. They wanted Rome out. They wanted the kingdom of David to reestablish, which God had promised, on my throne you will sit forever, but he meant spiritual reign over all the nations. And so because Jesus didn't fulfill the political aspirations of kicking Rome out and setting up the glory of the David kingdom, the Davidic kingdom, he didn't meet the obligations. And they were basically in the line of the Indiana Jones great line, they were digging in the wrong place. They're looking for the wrong Messiah. He fulfilled everything the Old Testament talked about, and then some. But he didn't fulfill the cultural, religious expectations of the day, and so they killed him. They saw him as a threat. I know. And then he rose again.
Right.
And he said he would.
Yeah. You've convinced me.
Well, thank you. I'm case closed. Two of us believe.
I just wish, like, I know that faith is a part of it, but I just wish I could, like, there's a part of me that's like, I just want to prove it and be like, now you all have to believe. But like you said, even people who saw it with their own eyes still did not believe.
All right, so you indicated we're airing this during Lent, right?
Yes.
So Easter service at ACF, I'm talking about 5 things you didn't know about the resurrection. And I'm making this case pretty firmly that there's a lot to this story that doesn't always get airplay, and you might want to do all the homework before you make a conclusion, because if it's true, it's the most important fact in history.
Yeah.
And you can't ignore it. If he really is Lord, you better shape up.
Right.
Because he's coming back. And if you're looking for a place to come for Easter, friends, tune in at ACF or come join us, because we're going to talk about this in pretty clear detail.
And it'll be available online for people who aren't local.
And it will be available online.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, we've actually run out of time. I figured we might
Shocker.
go long on this one. If you guys have any follow-up questions to what we talked about today, I know a lot of people have been writing lately asking about the validity of the Bible. We actually have done a really deep dive in that in another episode, so you'll be able to find some supporting material in prior episodes. But if you have any other questions that we have not addressed, please send them to us at acfellowship.org/podcast. And thank you, Will,
Thanks,
for
Lauren.
joining us and letting me ask you all these questions.
Love it.
We will see you guys next week.